Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the National Extension College in our season of webinars. I'm really delighted to have along with me Louise Musgrave, who's a student recruitment manager for the online campus at the University of Law. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you so much. And yes, welcome everybody. I really appreciate you taking out the time today to learn about some true crimes and some real criminal investigations. And we're going to go into that in more detail. Oops, my screen.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to it. So Louise, what you don't know is I studied a degree and master's in law.
Oh, okay. Fabulous.
So
you're the perfect person to have on the call because you'll be able to.
Yeah, well, perhaps, but this was a long time ago in the 90s, before the whole true crimes element really came to the fore. But I still like to listen to a few true crime podcasts, which I'm sure some of our students do as well. So please, students, all say hello. Please do, and I've noticed a couple have already said hello, so thank you for that. If you want to say where you're from or what you're studying or why you're interested in joining this, just say hello or hi in the chat, and we'll say hello back. I think, Louise, this is an interactive session. Is that correct?
Yeah, so feel free. I mean, obviously, I can't see the chat box, but I know that you're kindly going to help out. So whatever you read in the chat box, then do, if it's relevant at that particular time, do let me know. It's great to find out where you're all from. And probably my first question to you all, is anybody interested in working in the area of law? Does anyone want to be a solicitor, or maybe a police officer, maybe in criminology? I don't know if that sort of interests anybody.
Good. We've had a couple of hellos already, and do say if there's an area of law that you're interested in. I'm sure that will be useful for Louise as she runs through her presentation. So I think we're 3 minutes in, so hopefully most people are just joining now. So I think if you're okay, Louise, we'll start. I'll just mute myself, but I'll unmute if there's a comment or something that needs to be put forward by the students, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Great. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the University of Law. We've actually been running for a long time, since 1867, and we do predominantly offer the undergraduate law degree that you would need to start you on your road to becoming a solicitor or barrister. But don't worry, if you don't study law, you could maybe study another degree, maybe chemistry, biology, it doesn't matter what degree. And we also offer conversion courses into law, or now you can go straight on to a postgraduate course. That's a course after your degree, enabling you to become the solicitor or barrister. But most importantly, at your stage now, you're probably thinking about, what degree should I study? Now, we do offer law, but we also offer degrees in policing. You now need a policing degree to become a police officer. And we also offer degrees in criminology. So perhaps you want to get involved with the criminal justice system and actually research and find out, how to stop people offending, or maybe working within the prison service. So that, again, is a really interesting degree that I know many students are coming onto that course that we offer. And more recently, we've diversified into other areas. We do also offer business degrees, and new for 2022, degrees in psychology and computer science as well. So just that's a bit about us. And today, also to let you know, I come from the online campus. So that means if you wanted to continue to study online, that is completely a possibility. You can study the LLB undergraduate law degree online, or you could go to our multiple locations across the UK. We have a number of campuses. We're not a huge university of one big campus, but we have campuses in Birmingham, Bristol, Chester, Guildford, London, Leeds, Manchester and Nottingham. So if you did want to go to the bricks and mortar way of studying, you can do, but obviously if you want to study online, that's the campus that I work for, and hence I'm talking to you today. So we have we have trained more practicing lawyers than anyone else in the UK, and we are for 2020 we were actually rated first for student satisfaction. We have an amazing careers team to help you. So once you start with us, we will help you to get out into the world of work experience. Obviously, coming across the medium of virtual studying, then we try to get you virtual work experience if possible as well. and we offer virtually sort of presentations from barristers or solicitors, and our tutors are available to you as well to talk to you about those different career possibilities. We have over 71,000 alumni in our network. So we've trained a lot of lawyers. Now, today's presentation, we have got, you're welcome to sort of click on to that little gecko there, the QR code, and you can sign up with us and actually be notified of more events like this that's happening today. We have online competitions. I mentioned that sort of virtual experience, a possibility to gain experience. And also we can email you information and help you to stay up to date about degrees. So do click through to that QR code and fill in your details as we go through the presentation. And I will be mentioning it a bit later on, so you can go back to that. But the agenda for today, it's going to be a bit of an interesting exploration of some certain cases. We're going to look at the case of Gypsy Rose and examine the sentencing. We're going to look at the Miscarriage of Justice, the Bridgewater Four. And I don't know if you've heard of any of these crimes before. And we will also look at some financial crime. And this is quite important today because Ponzi Scheme, and I'll go through that in great detail a bit later on, they do happen today. So it's also a warning not to get yourself involved in any of them. And then finally, we're going to look at a very famous case, Jack the Ripper. And we're going to look at the evidence there and look at how you would maybe study that if you were looking at police policing as a degree. So let's first of all look at Gypsy Rose. I don't know if anyone's heard about this case before, but Gypsy Rose Blanchard lived under the strict care of her mother, Dee Dee. Since early childhood, Gypsy believed she suffered from a range of debilitating conditions, including leukemia, muscular dystrophy, cancer, and brain damage. Dee Dee insisted to medical staff that her daughter suffered from these conditions, despite them rarely finding any evidence to prove it in tests. The two eventually moved to Missouri and settled there for a few years. As Gypsy grew older in her teens, she started to realize the depth of her mother's deception. In truth, Gypsy was actually a healthy person with none of the illnesses her mother claimed. She was forced to be fed through a tube and get around in a wheelchair through psychological and physical abuse from Dee Dee. Dee Dee had what is known as Munchausen syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of that before. So it's Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is where caregivers exaggerate or make up conditions, usually in order to receive attention, praise, or some other benefit. Gypsy obviously began to rebel, including joining an online dating site where she met and began a relationship with a certain individual called Nicholas Gojon. She confided a lot about her situation to Gojon. Eventually, they hatched a plan to murder Dee Dee. Gypsy asked her boyfriend, who was in love with her, to kill her mother using a knife she bought herself. Once he did, they ran away together but were caught 5 days later after posting a disturbing message from Dee Dee's Facebook page. Authorities were able to track the location and found Gypsy and Nicholas, and of course then the case began. The trials were long and sensationalized due to the unique nature of the situation. Nicholas Gojon, it was actually argued that he had limited mental capacity, and that's important to sort of remember at this stage. We're not sort of drawing a link to this and the crime he committed, but more that he may not have been able to make sound, reasoned judgments. He had a lower than average IQ and suffered with mental illness, possibly a split personality disorder or schizophrenia. So do you think this changes in terms of how guilty he is or shouldn't be? What are your sort of views on that? If somebody commits a crime and they are manipulated because they're mentally vulnerable, do you think if you were in the court case, you were perhaps sentencing, would you be more lenient because the person had limited mental capacity? Would you, I don't know if anyone's able to type in the chat box your sort of thoughts there. I mean, are they?
Be great, thanks, Louise. So you've put some really useful statements up there. It'd be interesting if anybody in the webinar wanted to either say whether there's one of those statements that they agree with, or perhaps something else that they feel is pertinent to that question that you've put.
Yeah. So no matter, do you think no matter what, murder is murder? I mean, that's another thing to sort of think about. Some people say, well, it doesn't matter if they had mental capacity issues or that Gypsy Rose was abused through the mother, obviously having Munchausen by proxy. Nicholas was the only best person in Gypsy's life who acted in her best interests. So what are your sort of thoughts on that? Are there different levels of how guilty somebody is? Is anyone able to write in there?
I think they're all thinking. It's quite an interesting question, isn't it? No comments so far, but a few people have said a hello, so they're obviously listening in and thinking about this. So somebody said, I think mental health and trauma could be considered in the verdict. So there's a very legal term there.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah.
Thanks very much. Somebody else said it's a criminal trial, and I'd focus on the facts and the evidence.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, that's what criminal trials are all about. And they won't come to trial unless there is enough evidence. So that's normally, I mean, in Britain, we have the CPS, Crown Prosecution Service, and they look at all the evidence from the police and then decide whether a case should go to court. So, but then obviously they're criminologists that get involved and sort of look at, study the sentencing and how guilty is somebody, how, what's the sort of term that they should receive for their particular crime. Well, I think so. First of all, we have to understand what the difference is between or what is murder, what's the differences between them. And the way that we look at this in the UK is that we have something called actus reus, which is Latin, and it's basically a criminal code of the physical guilty act of the crime. Was there a crime committed? The murder consists of an unlawful killing of a human being in the Queen's peace. That's sort of the legal term. Or the mens rea, the guilty mind. So this is more sort of, is malice aforethought, which has been interpreted by the courts as a meaning intention to kill, so more sort of manslaughter. The condition is the mental part of the crime premeditated. So I don't know if anyone's heard of those differences before, but that's how it's sort of determined in the court cases. So you can see here, Blanchard actually got a 10-year sentence for second-degree murder, and Gojon was found first-degree murder. He had life without parole. So I don't know what your thoughts are on the actual sentencing. Do you think that was a fair sentence for both of them, or do you think that more of those points I brought up before should have been taken into consideration?
So we have a comment from Lisa who says common sense to show serious consideration due to mental health reasons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you have given Gojon life without parole? Then maybe not. Maybe that Gojon could have an opportunity to appeal against his conviction for life. Maybe he could have been given a lesser sentence to say that he had issues with mental capacity. Should Blanchard have got more of a sentence because she was the one that was premeditated and tried to push Gojon to go through with the act of murder? So all of these sort of things are quite interesting when we look at these cases. Is there anything more about Nicholas Gojon's sentencing in the chapter?
So we've got a visitor from Israel. Lovely to hear from you. Regarding the Israeli criminal law, the girl is guilty as well. She is the brain behind the murder. Her boyfriend is too. And we've had another comment from somebody, Igal, who's saying equally, they should have been equally sentenced. So that the sentences obviously aren't equal. But Igal is looking at them being an equal sort of criminal responsibility there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right. So that was a very interesting case to look at the sentencing and what actually is murder. So thank you for your input there. We're now going to look at another case, moving on to a miscarriage of justice. And unfortunately, this does happen today. Shocking, but nonetheless true, that there is less state support for the victims of miscarriages of justice than other guilty prisoners. There is only one source of help specifically available to this tiny subset of prisoners, the Royal Courts of Justice Miscarriage of Justice Support Service, run by the Citizens' Advice. And unfortunately, there are cases and we're going to look at a particular case today. So we've gone backwards, sorry, go forwards. And the case we're going to look at today is the killing of Carl Bridgewater. Now, I don't know if anyone's heard about that case before. I'm going to give you a bit of a background to it. So on the 19th of September 1978, so quite some time ago, 13-year-old Carl Bridgewater was carrying out a paper round at 4 p.m. Carl was making his way to Yew Tree Farm in Prestwood near Stourbridge, West Midlands. When he arrived, he disturbed what seemed to be an antiques burglary at the farm, and he was forced into the living room, where he was found shot in the face at close range. 4 local men, they were armed robbers, who became known as the Bridgewater Four, actually jailed for Carl's murder in 1979. There's so much criticism on the handling of the case, as there were clues and evidence that were not acted upon and disregarded, including confirmed alibis for some of the Bridgewater Four. So what actually happened there was evidence that was brought to case, and it was found that Patrick Malloy, who was one of the alleged, was basically had a coerced confession. So Malloy, who for 10 days was denied access to a lawyer, so that he wasn't allowed to see a lawyer, at first denied the murder, but later, according to police, made a statement saying he'd gone to Yew Tree Farm. Then he later retracted his statement, claiming he was coerced into confessing with violence. So actually the police had violently forced him into this confession. Also on the day, no witnesses saw the 4 men. The only witness in the area claimed he saw a car matching the description of the police's first suspect. And their first suspect was the local antiques dealer, Bert Spencer, who was parked at the farm earlier at that day. There was no DNA found for any of the alleged, and there was no gun found either. So we had all of these sort of areas, but obviously the Bridgewater Four were convicted, which is very sad, and sent to prison for 19. They were in prison for 19 years, and after their imprisonment, 3 of the Bridgewater Four were finally actually released. Malloy, unfortunately, died in prison of a heart attack 2 years into his sentence. And this case is still an unsolved murder case. And you can actually go on YouTube and have a look. There was a famous criminologist who actually investigated Bert Spencer, and looking at it, and I'm sure that he, as I, when I watched that documentary, really felt that probably Bert Spencer was the guy that did it, but there wasn't enough evidence to link him there. So it is still an unsolved murder case. And if you were the criminologist working with the lawyers of the Bridgewater Four, and you're appealing their sentence, you believe they're wrongly convicted, based on the case, what factors do you think you would bring forward if you were going to court to try and get these 4 local men off the hook, as it were? What would you use? After I've just given you some idea there, what would you think to bring forward?
Thanks, Louise. Let's wait for some of the comments to come through. We've got, were the police ever questioned about their mishandling? I'd look at the type of gun too. Maybe the farm had one. So 2 parts to that question. One is, what happens if there has been a miscarriage of justice around the police and the investigation? And then picking up on one particular part of the police's investigation around the evidence of the gun.
Yeah, I mean, the gun's really interesting because the murder weapon is obviously really helpful to the prosecution because it's an extremely powerful piece of evidence against the suspect. In addition to the weapon producing sort of potential DNA or fingerprint evidence, also potentially can sometimes produce an actual record of the suspect purchasing the weapon. And obviously those factors, as well as finding the weapon in the suspect's actual on them, it all sort of helps. There's strong examples of circumstantial evidence, which is often necessary, especially in cases where there's weak or direct evidence, so eyewitness or video, etc. So yeah, the gun is obviously a really good point. Okay, and anything else that you bring forward?
Any other comments from anybody on this case? It's interesting around the DNA, I think, Louise, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's obviously
Absolutely.
the earlier stages of using forensics and DNA. Do you know a little bit more about how that sort of was moved forward within the appeal?
Yeah, so basically the new aspects of in the case were that the police actually discovered a set of unidentified fingerprints on the bicycle used by Carl Bridgewater. I don't know. This was not disclosed at the original trial. So the men's lawyers believed the prints could have been left by the intruders at the farm who threw it into a pigsty. So, if they actually found those fingerprints or found some sort of DNA of someone else, that may have also helped. But it's something that was brought forward at the appeal. And also the witnesses as well. I don't know if anyone's written anything about that.
Not yet, no.
Okay, so the witnesses, again, in fact, there was no witnesses who saw the four men. The only witness in the area claimed he saw the matching description of the police first suspect, Bert Spencer. So, why wasn't he interviewed in more detail? And that's what the actual documentary, which you can go and have a look online, really investigates. So, again, if you're thinking about becoming a criminologist, this is sort of areas that you may help in certain trials to rightly convict or to actually look at miscarriages of justice cases where you feel that people have been wrongly accused. So
do you think this type of case and this miscarriage would happen now, or have there been enough checks and measures in place, do you think, that would stop this type of case happening again?
I think with the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, I think it's their job to really look at all the evidence. So I think before that was introduced, that probably, obviously tried to stop those issues happening. I do think there are, if you look at the Stephen Lawrence case,
yes,
evidence, I think it was on a certain jacket that was provided, was tampered with, so that Stephen Lawrence case wasn't very recent, but it does still happen.
We've got one of our students, Eugene, has said there's a similar trial about police using bad practices and getting a confession in the court now, the Rada murder trial. So thank you, Eugene. I'm sure that's one that the students in the webinar will be able to go away and have a look at as well. So there's still obviously lots of areas from a justice perspective that still needs to be looked at.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Eugene, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really good. Okay, so here, this is a bit more on that case. So we looked at obviously the coerced confessions, the forced confessions as well, vulnerable defendants. Unfortunately, that all led to the conviction. But obviously now, as I mentioned, we have the CPS, which is the Crown Prosecution Service, and they are solicitors that will look at the evidence brought forward for that particular case. I don't know if anyone watches 24 Hours in Police Custody. That's a really interesting program on television that shows you what happens within that 24 hours. Enough evidence has to be brought forward to charge a criminal or suspected criminal, and it's the Crown. They send all the evidence and the information to the CPS, and they decide whether that individual will be brought to justice. And sometimes there's not enough evidence, and even though the person's committed the crime, and the CPS actually push back and say, unfortunately, this case cannot go to court because on this occasion and as much as the police want to see a conviction, sometimes the CPS are unable, with the evidence put forward, to actually bring that case to court. So and
we've had a student say they find that a very interesting program as well. So just validating your statement, Louise. If you have an interest in crime, I think it's something really interesting to watch.
Absolutely. Okay, now we're going to look at a conman, the world's greatest conman. I don't know if anyone's heard of Charles Ponzi before, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about Charles Ponzi. So Charles Ponzi once said, "I was looking for trouble and I found it. Truer words were never spoken from an early age. Ponzi discovered that hard work and book learning were not for him, and he was always involved in one scheme after another, hoping that one day or someday he would find the one thing that would make him rich beyond his wildest dreams. Born in 1882 in Parma, Italy, Charles Ponzi was the infamous swindler who paid out returns with other investors' money. Ponzi arrived in Boston Harbor on November the 15th, 1903, aboard the SS Vancouver. He mentioned that he gambled away most of his money on the voyage to America. I landed in this country with $2.50 in cash, and he lost the rest of his money playing cards during the transatlantic crossing. However, he did have $1 million in hopes, and those hopes never left him. This charisma and confidence would help him pull off one of the greatest financial schemes in history. After he spent a few years in prison in Montreal, Canada, for forging a check for $223.58, he returned to Boston, USA, where he found himself in trouble again and back in jail for 2 years for smuggling Italian immigrants across the border. It was a little while later after he introduced the infamous Ponzi scheme, and that was his get rich quick scheme. So how did that work? Well, Ponzi scheme is basically an investment scheme where you rob Peter to pay Paul. So Ponzi would start with a small amount of investors' money to put money into his legitimate business, which was initially buying IRC, international reply coupons, which were basically vouchers for postage to send a letter in a different country. His idea was that you buy them at a price in one country, then you sell it in the USA at a profit. Once he persuaded people to invest in his business, Ponzi would offer to give them back their money with interest. Ponzi promised returns of 50% in 45 days or 100% in 90 days. He would then use his next investor's money to pay his previous investors a sum of money back. This is also known as a dividend. Ponzi's biggest talent wasn't his knowledge of finances, but his skill he had with people. His appeal was his non-aggressive selling skills by casually flaunting his success and only going into detail when pushed by others. And then, if they absolutely insisted, he would take their money. It wasn't long before Ponzi had tens of thousands of people investing in his business until he was making himself $250,000 a day. Ponzi had a lavish lifestyle, buying himself a 12-bedroom mansion in Lexington, Massachusetts. He rode around town in a custom-built limousine, wearing expensive suits, diamond tie-pins, and carrying a gold cane. Ponzi continued to pay off the previous investors. He kept doing this, but making more and more profit for himself each time. And if you look at the chart, you can see how much money he made. Blue is the money he was making, and purple is the color he paid back from previous investors. However, this obviously can't last forever. Eventually, the scheme will collapse, and in some cases, you make a run for it as a millionaire. However, this wasn't the case of Ponzi. His own publicist described him later as a financial idiot who couldn't even add. Ponzi's world came tumbling down in the summer of 1920 when the Boston Post, who won the Pulitzer Prize for public service, exposed him as being insolvent. In fact, Ponzi had never cashed in any IRC coupons in the US. He was revealed as being lots of dollars in debt. The federal charges against him was mail fraud. The collateral was huge, with the collapse of 6 banks, and investors received as little as 30 cents on the dollar on their investments. So there was a lot of angry people. So it was estimated $7 million that he owed. He was arrested on the 12th of August 1920 with 86 counts of mail fraud, and he was sentenced he was guilty and sentenced to prison for 14 years. So, a real, some people may not have described him as an evil man. I don't know what your sort of views are on this scheme. Do you think that was right that he was sent to prison, or do you think that, those people were silly, they shouldn't have given their money to him anyway? They should have realized what they were investing in.
I suppose it's quite interesting from a psychological perspective, because he obviously grasped the understanding of greed in a way, didn't he? And people wanting more. So not only his own greed, but recognised other people, humanities can be the same. So people were obviously wanting to believe they could get 50 to 100% on their money in an easy way. So yes, novels and this, we've had a student say not evil, but definitely greedy. And also that they've heard of the phrase, the Ponzi scheme, but didn't know where and I'm the same actually, I didn't know it came from a real person, and that's why the scheme was given that name. So fascinating. Thank you, Louise.
Yeah, and he also influenced others. And as I say, it's not something that's happened and never happened again. I don't know if anyone's heard of Bernie Madoff, or Bernie Madoff, as they like to call him on the internet. He was really famous for conning people that he actually worked with, very influential rich people. I think you had to have a certain amount of dollars to invest in his banking scheme, and lots of CEOs of companies and politicians invested in him, and obviously that all came crumbling down, and he was arrested and put into prison. And there was another guy called Lou Pearlman. I don't know if you know that band, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. I don't even remember those from the 90s.
I am that old.
Yeah. So he was another one that got people to. He started off in the music industry and got people to invest, and he had fake offices set up so people would call him. It was actually just friends of his that were working there, and he got sent to 25 years in prison. And you can look at all of these type of cases online, as on YouTube, and learn about how Ponzi carries on to this day. But some people say, well, that people should be more aware of where they're putting their money in. There's many pyramid schemes that you have to be careful. Even myself, I was contacted by a friend that said, well, if you sell this particular brand of makeup, if you sell an X amount, you'll get so much back in revenue, and you have to be careful even today that they're going on. So
another student has added a little bit of detail, so saying that his understanding is that the suspicion started when Ponzi sued one of the investors who didn't pay him. So that's the ultimate in greed and naivety, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's
using the law when you're yourself doing something illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's a very interesting case, and as I say, you can learn more about it online. But it's normally quoted. I've watched many films, and the Ponzi scheme is quoted a lot in today's society. So he certainly made a name for himself.
Somebody said they think Kevin Spacey was a victim of Bernie Madoff as well. So some very well-known names there. So it's not just, sort of people in the street who are victims here. It's also obviously the well-known. Thank you. So I'll leave you to move on, Louise. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at Jack the Ripper. So has anyone heard of Jack the Ripper before? Know anything about the case of Jack the Ripper? Anyone?
I think there's many dramas and TV series, aren't they, that how true they are to the real case, I think would be interesting, but many different adaptations over the years that I've seen myself.
Yes, yeah. And if anyone gets the chance to go to the London dungeons, you can actually experience what it's like to be in the East End of London, and you feel like you're back on the streets of what's happening in those times. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a bit about Jack the Ripper now. So the cold case reopened. So dear boss, grand job. The last job was I gave the lady no time to squill. How can they catch me now? I love my work and I want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games, my knife so sharp, and I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Those are words from a letter that London Central News Agency received on September the 27th, 1888. It was then passed on to Scotland Yard, who were in the middle of investigating perhaps the most notorious killing spree of all time. Someone was attacking women in Whitechapel, London, and murdering them, and then cutting up their bodies in a gruesome fashion. The killer went by many names: the Whitechapel murderer, the leather apron, Saucy Jack, and of course Jack the Ripper. He remains unidentified to this day, so we're going to focus on his grim body of work, the murders, the suspects, the investigators. So in 1888, the Whitechapel parish in the East End of London was a place rife with crime. It was an overcrowded, low-income area with terrible housing and terrible working conditions. There was a brothel and a bar next to every brothel. The streets of Whitechapel were poorly lit, and it was here the unidentified murderer Jack the Ripper is said to have killed at least 5 London female prostitutes. The victims had their bodies mutilated in an unusual manner, indicating that the killer had substantial knowledge of human anatomy. Most of the women were found with throats cut and their abdominal area mutilated. He was never captured, and his case is one of England's most famous unsolved mysteries. The 5 killings were attributed to Jack the Ripper and all took place within a mile of each other, or near the Whitechapel district of London, from August to November 1888. Violence to prostitutes was not uncommon, excuse me, and there were many instances of women being brutalized, but the nature of these murders strongly suggests a single perpetrator. The concentration of the killings around weekends and public holidays and within a short distance of each other has indicated to many that the Ripper was in regular employment and lived locally. Others have thought that the killer was an educated, upper-class man, possibly a doctor or an aristocrat who ventured into Whitechapel from a more well-to-do area. Excuse me. There are many possible sightings, but it was difficult to determine which were hoaxes. A number of letters, around 700, were sent from the public to the London Metropolitan Police. Within these letters, there were some allegedly sent by the killer, taunting officers about his gruesome activities and speculating on murders to come. One in particular caught the attention of the police when it started with, "Dear boss," within the letter. It detailed that the killer would clip the lady's ears off. It was signed Jack. On September the 30th, 1888, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were killed on the same evening after the letter had been sent. Elizabeth had been found at 1 a.m. in Duckfield Yard, Berners Street, with a 6-inch gash to her neck. Excuse me, but no mutilations. People believe the killer had been interrupted during this killing. Within walking distance, in a place known as Mitra Square, Catherine was found shortly after with her neck cut and her body severely mutilated. Her face was disfigured and her intestines had been removed. Her left kidney was also removed, but most telling was the fact her right ear had been cut off, leading police to believe that he actually was the killer. So Jack the Ripper was never caught, and he's not thought to have killed again after November 1888. So those are the really sort of hard facts, if you like, of the case. And what I want to do now is have a look at the evidence. So really sort of take into consideration, there were 5 victims, the bodies were mutilated, they're all located in a local area, and the killings happened on weekends and public holidays. So we're going to look at now, if we were a police officer and we were looking at evidence put forward to us, and maybe obviously when murder trial or when murder investigations take place, the police sometimes can rely on witness evidence that's put forward, as well as obviously nowadays DNA. In those days there wasn't such thing as DNA evidence. So let's start to try and build a picture, and obviously the criminologists do this as well, of who perhaps the perpetrator may have been. So we're going to look at evidence-based policing in more detail. So we looked at the letters. We mentioned the Dear Boss letters, Saucy Jack, and they were taunting letters delivered to the police and to newspapers. Although the majority were likely hoaxes, and that happens in today's murder investigations, unfortunately, some people just like to get off on the back of murder investigations, and they come forward saying, they potentially can think they know the killer. So it's important that the police really do look at what's a hoax and what's correct and what's not. So there's a very strong possibility that 3 letters in particular were actually connected to the killer due to the details they disclosed of the murders. And that's why sometimes the police like to hold back information before putting information into the press, because sometimes that can actually damage their investigations, especially if the perpetrator wants to hide evidence. So handwriting of these 3 letters were also similar, but not exact. Blonde hairs, so short blonde hairs were found on at least 2 of the victims' bodies. These victims were brunette and red-haired, so it didn't belong to them. But blonde hairs were found on the 3rd victim, who was also blonde, but with much longer hair. A silk shawl. A silk shawl was found next to the body of the 4th victim. We mentioned Catherine Eddowes. It has some stain of human bodily fluids thought to be linked to the killer. So at the time, police could only try to track down who may have purchased the scarf, but they were unable to pinpoint any buyers, but found the store in question, and the scarf was sort of mid-range in price. Now, there was actually, I've got a funny family story. You've got here sort of the witness statement. My great grandmother always proclaimed, they came from my whole family came from the East End of London. She always proclaimed that she thought she saw Jack the Ripper running out of late at night, running out of an alleyway. So that was our sort of family story. Yes, yeah.
Well, we've had a couple of theories put forward, Louise.
Right.
Whether your family stories are sort of around this type of thing. So one has said maybe one of the police officers, that the letter seems to fit that idea. I think you were saying around whether somebody knew a little bit of the detail.
Yeah.
Was that considered at the time? It would be somebody internal.
Maybe, yeah, that could potentially be, and also, letters, as we mentioned, sometimes now we can actually look at handwriting analysis as well these days, and look into more detail, the evidence of the actual handwriting, and the witness statement here. I mean, this was an actual witness statement from George Hutchinson, gave a statement about the last time he saw Mary Kelly, one of the victims. It was an hour or so before her estimated time of death. In his statement, he said, Mary passed me that night on Commercial Street where we said hello. I then saw her get picked up by a well-dressed man. Yeah. So potentially maybe there's a link there. The man had dark hair and wore a coat trimmed with astrakhan fur and a black tie with a horseshoe pin, dark spots, button over boots. So he seems well-to-do, and a large gold chain hanging across his waistcoat, and they went together in direction of her lodgings. So, could he have potentially been the person that committed the crime?
So another participant, Lisa, has said that a weekend and public holiday killing suggest he worked a very busy job, a Monday to Friday type of job, just looking at some of the evidence there, which perhaps fits with somebody being sort of well-dressed as well.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So we've got some people that could have potentially, they're loosely based on people and evidence from the actual case that were investigated. One was a barber. So he lived in Whitechapel. His appearance, he had brown hair and brown eyes. He was a Polish migrant, later admitted to a mental asylum, though had no harmful characteristics. Symptoms were mainly auditory hallucinations, though he had threatened his sister with a knife once in an argument. There was also a doctor, and the doctor lived in Ratcliffe, which neighbours Whitechapel, so he wasn't far. He had fair hair, blue eyes. He was unmarried and without children. He rented a room in a shared house close to the place of work. Other residents say he kept himself to himself and was quite unsocial. Early in his career, he was charged with the unlawful death of a patient. So, was he potentially the murderer? And also the profession of the nobleman. So he lived in the area of Westminster, very well-to-do man, a member of Victorian high society, wealthy and privileged. He was outgoing and sociable, and he regularly attended parties and banquets of other aristocrats. He took pride in his education. He was married with a young son whose education he was paying a lot of money for. Black hair and brown eyes. So if you were put all the evidence that I've given you, and these three individuals were put to you, who do you think you'd be more likely to lean towards of potentially being the murderer from the evidence that I gave you?
While everybody's thinking on that, we just have a sort of question from Joe. So why, and this could be for everybody as well as the question that you've asked, Louise, why do we think this case in particular is still so discussed and prominent within our culture? And we have some guests, international guests on the webinar. So it'd be interesting to see why this as a cultural case is still discussed and still it's sort of used and investigated.
I personally think it's because at the time, I think because it was unsolved and so many people died, were murdered under him. So, and it was, unusual as well for such a small area, especially in the East End of London. Everyone sort of knew everybody. It was very much a family community. So even though it was a poor background, it was very much a close community. So I think it was a shock to the community that happened. And the fact that they didn't have, in those days, obviously they didn't have the DNA evidence, and also I think people got on the back of it because a lot the story itself was turned into movies. You can, so I think that sort of kept it prominent in people's minds so many years later.
There's a couple of comments, one based on the person and one on that cultural context. So Igal's comment is around the fact that this person perhaps is lonely on holiday and is not with his family and friends, suggesting, I don't know, Igal, whether you feel that suggests one of these three types of people here. Perhaps you can have a think about that. And then another student has really mentioned about the women a couple of times, that it's good to really understand the women's story. Perhaps they were painted as prostitutes by the media just because, you know, it was obviously sort of helped them put forward not necessarily guilt or but just sort of help people understand that they weren't themselves. If you weren't a prostitute, you wouldn't perhaps be in any danger, and it was trying to put forward a little bit of safety around what was happening, but also perhaps slightly blame around the women as well. So there's quite a lot of cultural context, I think, that's interesting to historically to investigate with this case as well.
No, I completely agree. It's you know, it and like for people that live abroad, I'm sure you'll probably know that this is probably one of our most prominent cases, along with some of the, you know, Yorkshire Ripper and other murders, because on a large scale, it's I don't know what sort of the crime rate is, but it's not usual in the UK to have serial killers. So I suppose it's also the fact that it was more than one murder. But
I think there's options of I mean, when I studied law a number of years ago, there were options and modules to look at female crime, media, crime in the media, and all different aspects of crime, which I'm sure the University of Law has as well. So you can investigate it of an angle that you find interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, right. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else anyone would like to talk about on this particular case?
No, I think we've covered a few of those discussion points. Thanks, Louise.
Okay, no problem. Right, so that comes to the end of the cases that we were going to look at today, and hopefully it's given you, you know, some idea of maybe areas that you would find interesting to go and work in. Maybe you enjoyed investigating and that's something that you think maybe the policing angle might be right for you. Maybe criminology might be of interest. I'm going to show you some podcasts, because I think it's really important that you try to investigate cases, look at the outcomes, maybe read about the trials that happen. And we run something called Criminal Investigation Day, where we look at the Stephen Lawrence case in great detail. So do sign yourself up. There's going to be some of those events happening in the near future, and it's all good for you to put on your CVs to say that you've attended our Criminal Investigation Days, and then obviously that's what it's all about now, sort of reading quality media articles, building up. You obviously need to have your good grades that you're going to get from college, but also other areas that you can get involved in. So gain that commercial awareness, try to get work experience if you can, and if you're not able to go out and get work experience, try to look for virtual work experience. If you can, take on positions of responsibility locally to you, and participate in these extracurricular activities. And that's where the University of Law can help you to do that. As I mentioned before, we do have events that happen, and I'll click on the Gecko QR code again. We also have ULaw podcasts. So on our webpage, which is www.law.ac.uk, which I'll type in the chat box when I've finished this presentation, then you can have a look on our website and access the podcast there. We also say to students, listen to Serial. I don't know if you've heard of that before, that podcast, where you can keep up to date on trials that are happening now or trials that have happened in the past, and with lawyers sort of discussing that. We've also got Lawyer to Lawyer, Lawpod UK, the hearing, lots of Law in Action, lots of different podcasts that you can extend your knowledge obviously we've just covered some areas today, but I think the more that you can do, the better it is. So here is that QR code that I was talking about. So make sure that you click onto that, fill in your details, and as I said, we will notify you of events, competitions, we'll help you to gain experience. We run competitions like real world essay competitions and things that if you win it, then you're going to get prizes, but also something to put on your CV. And you can stay up to date about our degrees as well. So we're contactable on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, all the normal mediums of social media, Twitter, Instagram, and you can use the hashtag liveprospectus.com. And there you go, in the corner there on the left hand side, you've got the law.ac.uk. That is our website. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's session. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now.
That was fascinating, Louise. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. And even though I studied law, I've learned a lot there, particularly about the Ponzi scheme. I found that was very interesting. And really good to share the podcasts. Some of those I'd heard of, some not before. So that's great. We will share the slides with those who've registered for the webinar. So if you didn't have time to take all that down, you will get an opportunity to see particularly the podcast, so that you'll be able to see those. Thank you so much for joining us and for being able to present just before our long weekend here in the UK. Hopefully it's been of interest to everybody, and obviously you've got the contact details there if you would like to contact the University of Law or Louise. So thank you all for joining and for your participation, and thank you, Louise.
Yes, thank you. Have a lovely few days celebrating the Jubilee as well. Thank you all.